Hey guys, it's Jess, and I'm excited to share another Maymay Made It design team post with you today. This time I'm doing something a little bit different than my normal card, and I'm kind of trying to get more into challenging myself in this way. This card is a little outside of my comfort zone in that I normally don't do one layer cards. Honestly, they kind of stress me out a little bit, and I just struggle with them, but I wanted to give it a try, and I thought that this stamp set would be perfect for trying to build a really cool scene with. So this stamp set is from Maymay Made It, and it is called Stuck on You. I've used it for a card once before, and I'll link to that video if you want to check that out as well. But I used it for like a wood grain background card before, but this time I wanted to do something different and create an entire scene with these cacti, and also some of the other, I think it's aloe, but I'm using it as kind of like a scrubby grass sort of plant. But you'll see how that goes in just a minute. So to get started, I used my mini Misty and I stamped out the two images where I wanted them on my card front. Now I'm going to be doing a lot of masking and a lot of layering and kind of trying to figure things out. So in order to do that, I'm using these sticky notes that are full sticky back. So the whole back of it is sticky instead of just the little part that connects it. And I'm going to be fussy cutting out the little masks. Once I am done with the masks, I did decide that I wanted to add some more to my background. At first I was just going to do the cacti, and then I decided that I wanted to add some extra little plants, so I went ahead and did that. Once I am finished with the fussy cutting, I will be back with you to see what our next steps are. All right, so I have a plan. I just used a pair of scissors to hand cut this little piece of cardstock that I'm going to use as my mask. I didn't have a die or anything that I wanted to use, so I just used a pair of scissors and kind of did it however I thought it looked nice. So I'm going in with some Distress Oxides. I'm going to be using a lot of Distress Oxides for this. I'm going in with some Walnut stain and creating hills using this little mask. And I'm just going to keep flipping it around and changing the direction so that I can get what looks like some really interesting hill details with only just this one piece of cardstock that I cut. So just by flipping it around or changing the angle, I can get some really cool looks, and I think that that's a really cool way to stretch your supplies, well, especially since I didn't even have to use a die for this. So I'm going in and darkening up some of the areas where I want it to look like there's a hill behind another hill, and then I'm adding in some more detail. The cool thing about these masks is that since the entire back of that post-it note is sticky, I don't have to worry about it popping up or moving around at all. It just stays nice and stuck, and I can ink blend right over top of it. It makes for really easy masking, which always helps. So I'm going in just to touch up some of the spots that I didn't quite get inked very well the first time. And it's okay if it looks a little messy right now. I'm not super worried about it because I do go back in and touch it up later once I've got my scene a little bit more developed. But for right now, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and see what looks okay. I'm going to leave my cacti masked, and you can see that I added those extra plants. Like I said, I'm using them as kind of like a scrubby brush or bush sort of thing in the desert, and I thought that looked pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and use my mask again. This time I'm using the opposite side because I want to keep what I already ink blended separate so that my colors don't go right over top of it. And I'm coming in with some antique linen. Now I am going to be using Distress Oxides for all of this, but I'm sure that you could probably do the same thing with your Distress inks. The finish is a little bit different. The oxides are a little more chalky and kind of smooth looking. The Distress inks, they just don't have that same chalky sort of finish, which is totally fine. It just depends on what sort of look you're going for, but the colors work really well together just the same. So if a color combination works well for a Distress Oxide, there's a great chance that you can use that same color combination for Distress inks, and that'll be fine. So whatever you have, you should be able to use. So I'm coming in with some carved pumpkin. Before that, I used some mustard seed. It seems like a waste because I come in and you'll see what I mean. This background sort of transformed. I had one idea in my mind, and then when I started doing all of the ink blending and adding in all of the colors, the whole background sort of warped. And instead of having this sunset sort of thing that I was starting with, I kept the sunset except for it kind of went more into a, like, the sun was really sinking behind the hills and it was mostly nighttime. So I added some seedless preserves and picked raspberry up at the top. Now I'm coming back in with some chipped sapphire. And this is where it really kind of started to change looks a little bit, because I went more with like kind of like a rounded ink blending. So I went on the sides and at the top, and that made it really look like the light was focused right behind the hill. I think it looks really super cool, but it wasn't originally what I was going for. I kind of added too much of the chipped sapphire and then I felt like I had to fix it. And so in me fixing it, this kind of just kept happening. And I was like, no, I'm ruining my pretty, look how much I've done all this work and I'm ruining it. But I think it actually turned out really cool in the end. So I'm glad that I did stick with it. Sometimes that's kind of when the best work happens, is when you think you've ruined something, but then you keep going. So coming back in with some of those other colors that I had already used, and just blending over it to brighten up some of the areas that I felt were a little too dark. And I think that really helped to give the effect of like the glowing sort of sunset vibe. Like I said, I really wasn't sure like how I felt about this, and I thought I had ruined it, but the cool thing about the oxides is that the more you blend them, the more they blend. I know that that seems ridiculous. It should seem very obvious, but like with the Distress inks, when you blend something and then you put a dark color over top of it, there's not really any going back from that. You either have to just work with what you have or start over. But with the oxides, when you blend a lighter color over a darker color, you actually do get some of that lighter color back in there. And so that was a really cool, and I think this actually turned out really super awesome, and I wouldn't have done this on my own. It was kind of just one of those happy accident sort of things. Okay, so now I'm done with my ink blending. I'm going to go ahead and add some lines to the hills. Now the reason I did this is because I felt like they needed a little bit more dimension. I'm using a dry paintbrush and I'm just putting it directly into my black Soot Distress Oxide ink pad, and I am using it to brush on some extra color just so that it's a little more defined. I did go back in with the walnut stain as well and kind of blur out the lines a little bit, because when I put the lines in the black soot I thought it was a little too dark, but in the end I think it looked nice that it had that dark shadow, because it really did give more definition and depth to my background scene. So I'm using my finger to just kind of like blur those lines a little bit. Sometimes you just got to use what you have. I think that worked out pretty well. It ended up looking fairly natural, especially given that it is nighttime, and some of those lines and shadows would be a little bit harsher than they would necessarily in the day. Okay, so touching up some of the areas with some walnut stain in the areas where I thought it was just a little bit too light, and I'm just pouncing that color directly on, again, just to add a little bit of texture and dimension. Okay, so I am done with my ink blending. I've got a cool scene going on here, right? Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the masks. Now, if I had been thinking about this, I would have waited to remove the masks until later when I added the stars. I didn't think about adding stars until after the fact, and then I had to put the masks back on. Luckily, I saved them and I hadn't ripped them up or anything, but it would have been better to just do it all at once. This is probably my favorite part, the fact that you can see how crisp and white all of that is with the masks removed. I think it's just so cool. It looks awesome. I am going to be doing some Copic coloring. It's going to take me a little bit to do that. I sped it up quite a bit, but I'll turn on some music and then I will be back with you after my Copic coloring is done. All right, now that all that Copic coloring is done, our scene is really starting to look a little more finished. I decided I wanted to add a sentiment directly to the background because this is a 1-layer card. So I'm going to go ahead and treat it with the anti-static powder. I put a lot of powder on this because I knew with all of that ink blending and all that Copic coloring that my paper might still be wet, and I didn't want my embossing powder to stick where I didn't want it. So I used my Mini Misty, stamped out my sentiment with the Brutus Monroe embossing ink, and then poured on the alabaster embossing powder, also from Brutus Monroe. Whoops, there you got to see me dump embossing powder all over my desk. Have no fear, I cleaned it up. I was able to save most of it and put it back in my jar, but accidents happen, you know, it's life. Okay, so I did go ahead and heat emboss my sentiment up top. I think it turned out really super cute. I like that the sentiment is good for kind of anything, like any sort of occasion that I forgot, a birthday, an anniversary, any sort of anything. What a sticky situation, I forgot. I think that's really cute. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm using some gesso. This is opaque white gesso, and I spritzed it with a little bit of water. Sorry, I'm a little out of focus. Spritzed it with a little bit of water, and now I'm using a Tim Holtz splatter brush to apply tiny little flecks to my backdrop. I'm trying to focus it mostly around the outer edges. I'm putting a little bit in the center, but mostly towards where it is darkest. And I did use that mask to cover up the bottom. I put my masks back on there so that my cacti didn't get any stars on them. And look how stinking cute that is. I think the tiny little stars are perfect. I'm glad that I didn't do anything larger than that. So that actually finished off my card. All I did was mount it to a card base, and that is it. I hope you love it. If you do, be sure to give me a thumbs up. Drop me a comment down below to let me know what you think, and I will see you guys soon in another video.